All right. Well, the latest polling analysis is in, and it appears that not only has Kamala Harris closed the gap with Donald Trump, but has actually surpassed him, to include surpassing him in certain key swing states. But is it true? Now, it would be really easy for us to just dismiss the polling and say it's all stupid. Or some people even go so far as to say, well, the Democrats cheat anyway, so who cares? We're not going to do that today. Right? We're actually going to look at what the polls say. We're going to go behind just the top level numbers, and we're going to try to take a look at what's going on and see, is there an explanation for this? Is this really going on? We are going to ask the question of whether or not there's some cheating taking place, but I assure you it's not going to be in the way that you think. It's not going to be in the way of the movies that Dinesh D'Souza and everyone else has put out. It's not going to be about stuffing ballot boxes. It's actually going to be about something that is a lot more, let's just say, pervasive, right? It's a lot more problematic. Plus, we're going to ask the question about what, if anything, can we do about it? And spoiler alert, there is stuff you can do about it. So do not despair, because we're going to discuss all of that and more coming up on this episode of Making the Argument. I am your host, Nick Freitas. With me in the studio, my beautiful bride, Tina, Queen of the Bees.
Hello, everyone.
Tina has threatened to go full Tina Day, because when we look at some of these polling and we look at some of the responses given for why people are voting in certain directions, she has threatened to take off whatever filter you thought existed. We'll see what happens. All right. Then, of course, we have our resident historian and political prognosticator, somebody that loves to go over polls and can actually tell you quite a bit about which polls are actually pretty good and done fairly well, and which ones are maybe a little bit more politically motivated. Christian Hines. How you doing, Christian?
I'm doing well. I think we're all pretty hyped up. We all kind of hyped each other up like 5 minutes before we turned the cameras on.
Well, here's the, let me lay the groundwork real quick. So again, what we're going to be talking about today is going over some of the polls, some of the stuff that we've seen in the media. We're going to talk about some obvious trends. Some of the stuff won't surprise you. Other stuff probably will, and the implications about it probably will. The good news is that everything that we're going to talk about does have some answers. It has some solutions that we can work toward if people are willing to get serious, and they're not just going to black pill themselves and decide, well, what does it matter, and then go home and let the country pretty much destroy itself. But one of the things that we're going to have to ask ourselves as we go through the data, as we look at the results, as we look at the trends that are taking place, one of the things that we have to ask ourselves is that whether it's true that Kamala is ahead in the polls, or whether it's not true, whether this is all window dressing, right? Either one of those things actually tells us something really interesting about the state of affairs in the United States right now. And that's what we want to get behind. We don't want to just look at polls, or we don't want to just find excuses that work for us. We actually want to look at what does it say about the state of things in the country, because that's what we need to start getting serious about if we actually want to save the republic. And one of the things that you're going to need to understand if you want to save the republic is you got to be well fed, man. You got to have protein, all right? I'm sorry to any of our vegan watchers, but we're not saving the republic on a diet of vegetables, all right? You're going to need protein, and that's where Good Ranchers comes in. And I'm going to tell you right now, this is your shot today. If you order today, you can get your Good Ranches before Labor Day. Now, I don't know about you, but we've got some birthdays coming up in our family and friend group, and we've got Labor Day coming up, and we plan to do some barbecue. We plan to do a lot of it. We plan to do a lot of grilling. And Good Ranches is our go-to. Pure, uncut, delicious Good Ranchers. And if you go to goodranchers.com right now and use promo code Nick, not only are you going to get free express shipping, not only are you going to get $25 off your first box, but right now they got a special deal going where if you sign up for one of the subscriptions, you're going to get free, your choice, free chicken breast, black Angus ground beef, applewood smoked bacon, or wild caught salmon as a free add-on to your subscription for every order for a year. Right? It just comes to you. They just give it to you for free because Good Ranches is all about making sure that you're well fed. You're well fed. And that's something we care about. And anytime people come over to the house, I'm always trying to throw food at them. Why? Because
Yes.
we live south of the Mason-Dixon. That's what we do. We feed people. Goodranchers.com, promo code Nick. Go check that out. Again, order today. You can use the link in the description. You order today. It will be here for your Labor Day weekend barbecue, cookout, pool party, all of the above, whatever it might be. Goodranchers.com. When you support them, you support you, and you support us. So that's like a three-fer. The three-fer right there. All right, go and check that out. All right.
Yeah, hold on. How old do you guys think Nick's going to be on Thursday? Like, tell us in the comments, because we're going to actually go live on Nick's birthday. That's on Thursday.
Oh, we are, aren't
Yeah.
we?
62.
Oh, I wasn't even thinking about that.
What better way to celebrate Nick's birthday than to spend it with you guys?
Our producer, Nate Clancy, my very good friend, is over like 62. He's 62. It's got to be in the
I was going to
60s.
guess 65 because you're a boomer who hates my Twitter profile.
That's because your Twitter profile is lame, you weeb.
You are currently winning that poll.
I know.
Someone said 41.
41. Oh, look at that. Oh, look, some of the numbers coming in. I always like it when people say, Nick, you look really good for 50. I'm like, thanks. Because
people
not.
always say that
36.
jokingly. Okay, you want to talk about a poll that actually really matters, though.
I got to say, I apparently look my age.
Yeah, people are real close.
I apparently look my age or older. I'll just go ahead and
Someone
tell you
says
that.
39 and holding.
Oh, there we go. See, that's a good person right there. That's just a nice person.
58?
Wow. Who is that?
69
Who said
what?
that? 58.
Most people are guessing like mid-40s.
Elizabeth, come on. Wow.
Oh, man.
All righty. Well, let's go ahead and jump into this real quick. All right. So one of the things that we're going to take a look at here is the polling trends that have been taking place. So as we look up at our screen right here, the trends for a while, especially when this was Trump v. Biden, we saw it like overwhelmingly for Trump. In fact, if you look at the biggest gap that was taking place, you see when the debate took place and it became very, very obvious that, lo and behold, Joe Biden was not at the top of his game. The same media that had been telling us that, this impression that Joe Biden is not, completely cognizant or all mentally there, that's just a bunch of cheap fakes that are being put out by Republicans. And Kamala Harris was so proud to serve during this historic administration. It was all so great. And then the debate happened, and people realized, okay, Republicans are not lying to us. Everyone else is, because there was no possible way that they could hide the fact that Joe Biden was an obvious mental decline. And you saw this massive shift. So at that point, when Biden dropped out on July 21st, 2024, Trump was at about 48%, and Biden was about 43%. That was the
Trump
overall
was leading
average.
by 3 points.
That was the overall average. But once you looked into the swing states, all of a sudden places like Nevada were like plus 10, plus 13 Trump. And look, let's face it, the swing state polls are the ones that really have the most impact. The national level polling is fine. It gives you an idea of who might win the popular vote. But the swing state polls are really important. And Trump was dominating across the board, whether it was Georgia, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Arizona, Nevada. Every single one of those like key states, Trump had anywhere from like a 2 to 4 point advantage. And this is the part where all of a sudden the same people that had been promising us that Joe Biden was at the top of his game came to the conclusion that he really needed to drop out. And he did get forced out. There's no question. Now, what did we see right off the bat? Well, we still saw, you saw a bump for Harris. And part of this you can expect because, okay, we've replaced the guy that clearly is not mentally all there with someone who at least knows what day it is, right? Can at least walk up the stairs to Air Force One with not falling over, can walk off, can turn stage left and walk off without walking into a wall or talking to a flag or whatever it is. And so the fact that the Democrats went from candidate who was obviously suffering from like early stage dementia to a candidate that, again, I don't want to say
can doesn't treat stairs like a winter climb up Everest.
Yes. Yeah, that's probably the best way to put it. Because I was going to say can string a coherent sentence together. And
But
then
that's
I'm like,
not
oh,
true.
that's not actually true. But that's what it was, right? And then obviously they traded an old white heterosexual man, which is, of course, the pinnacle of evil. That is the top of the axis of evil for the left, right? A heterosexual white male is, when they
Maslow's hierarchy of evil.
Yes,
right? Yeah,
Maslow's hierarchy of evil. Heterosexual white men are at the top, and it's not even close, right? It's not even a pyramid, right? It's like a pile. It's what's that?
Pylon.
Yeah. Well, no, I'm trying to think of
Rectangle.
the obelisk.
Oh,
It's like an
the
Egyptian
obelisk of
right?
evil.
Yeah, like everyone down here.
Don't
is
you
equal,
feel
and then-
great, Nick?
Yeah.
That Tina, Nick and I are at the pinnacle of the obelisk of evil. You're not. You're one step below it.
I'm
down.
one step
Unless you
below.
identify as a man, of course. But
Yeah.
White-
Well, if you identify as if we identified as women, we would.
we'd be at the
automatically go-
bottom. We'd be at the
automatically-
pinnacle of the
You'd be
the
above
oppressed.
me.
The
If
oppressed
you,
category.
if you guys suddenly identified as women, you'd be above me.
Oh yeah. Oh, easily. In
And-
fact, you would not even be worthy to be in our presence, and we would immediately
Right.
take whatever sporting events you liked.
Yeah,
But then-
so they swapped out the embodiment of evil for
yeah,
the embodiment of the victim mentality, the literal DEI candidate.
Yeah.
And no, that is not an exaggeration. Harris is not qualified to be president whatsoever. She wasn't even qualified to be Attorney General of California.
Well, do you know what one of the key indicators that maybe Kamala Harris was not who anybody wanted to be president? It was the fact that when she ran for the presidency in 2020 and didn't even make it to Iowa as a candidate, despite the fact that she was propped up by the Obama machine and everyone else as being the next greatest thing and first black woman president, the whole deal, like all of that, and she could not even make it to Iowa because she had performed so badly. Tulsi Gabbard, I mean, essentially ended her presidential race when she pointed out some obvious statistics about what she did as Attorney General of
Which
California.
is interesting because Gabbard just endorsed Trump yesterday.
Yeah.
But honestly, it's not terribly surprising though that you would see like to go back to this trend line for a second.
Yeah.
So we showed the actual charts, right? But the other component of this is, you know, just the raw polls here.
Yeah.
Right. It used to be when it was Trump v. Biden that, I mean, Trump was leading literally every single national poll.
Go back down the graph real quick, because this takes what you see right here is that Trump led every single poll from early March to mid-August.
Yeah.
And then mid-August is where so Biden drops out on July 21st. You know, Kamala Harris is the heir apparent, but there's still some confusion on what could potentially happen. Is everybody going to get on board? Is this really what's going to happen? Because keep in mind, the Democratic Party worked overtime to ensure that there was no primary challenge to Joe Biden. They completely, you know, rigged the system against RFK Jr. They went out of their way to make sure that he couldn't even participate in it. Again, the party of democracy made sure that everybody knew that they would decide who their candidate was. But then all of a sudden you see the flip, right? That's where you see the flip taking place in mid-August. This is a combination of you've gone past the bump that the Trump campaign would have gotten from the Republican convention, and now you're moving into anticipation of the Democratic convention. And if you look at the way the Democratic convention ran, they rolled out a lot of star power. They did all of that, and so it's not unusual to see something of a bump, but there's no question that when you look at the RCP average, so let's go in and look at the polls again at the top graph here. There's no question that regardless of who we're talking about, right? Like, so Data for Progress, that's a Democrat pollster. Rasmussen tends to be a little bit more on the conservative side. But a lot of these other ones are just considered either somewhat middle of the road, or they at least
center left or center right.
Yeah, they make an attempt at using fairly well-established, data in order to develop their polls. Now, you can argue all day long when you look at the, behind the scenes and you look at individual polls. Do you think they oversampled Democrats? Do you think they oversampled single women? Do you think they oversampled white men? Right?
There's always issues within the crosstabs,
Yes.
but as we talked about when we did our episode on, and it's interesting because there were a lot of people that wanted a follow-up to it because Biden dropped out. But when we did our episode about polling predictions and basically the general election predictions that we did a couple months ago, back when it was Trump versus Biden.
Yeah.
And we predicted that Trump was going to win against Biden. I still think if Biden had stayed in the race that Trump would have defeated him.
Yeah.
But now the calculations changed, right? Because the Democrats have a different candidate. The polling situation has shifted in their favor.
It's a real race now.
It's a
is
real
what it
race.
is.
And if you want proof that it's a real race, here's what Polymarket says. This is the betting markets. This is where money is being put up.
Yeah.
It's as close to 50-50 as you can possibly get. Technically, they keep swapping places. It's like, depending on the day, Trump's at 49 and Harris is at 50, or Harris is at 49 and Trump is at 50. Currently, Polymarket shows that Trump's at 50% and Harris is at 49%. This is not in the polls. This is odds of winning the election.
So let's look at a couple of things here, right? So obviously, one of the reasons why the betting markets are interesting to look at, as apart from polls, is because when someone answers a poll, there's no stakes in it, right? You can say whatever you want. Now, obviously, you kind of anticipate that people are going to say what you would anticipate they actually believe. When it comes to the betting market, now you have people that are analyzing data, right? So they're not just telling you what their opinion is with respect to who's going to win. They're analyzing data because now they have money.
They're risking money.
They're risking money. Now, does that mean that people couldn't manipulate, market data by, a bunch of low dollar bids or whatnot to try to get it in a particular direction? Yeah, sure, they potentially could. Could you have like a large scale Democrat supporter that doesn't care about, the money they're going to make on this particular thing? They want to skew things in a particular direction because they believe that this actually helps their candidate. Yeah, sure.
But you could get the same thing on the Republican side.
Yeah, but what you really got here is that on average, you've got people that are they're not telling you what they personally believe. They're anticipating what's going to happen in anticipation of making money by getting it right. And this is where it's going back and forth, on the markets. And so it's an interesting way. Again, I don't think that the market, the betting market on this is like a guarantee. Oh yeah, that's the surefire way to do it. But what it does is it adds a different level of analysis where people who presumably want to make good bets, want to make money, are going to do a little bit more of a deep dive into what they anticipate is going to happen, and then they bet that way, not necessarily based on who they want to win. Right? Would that be a fair?
The way that I would put it is that betting markets typically outperform polling in terms of predicting the outcome.
Do you know why that might be? Nick's mom is famous for always being like, well, they always call while all the Republicans are at work. So that's why it's always a little askew.
Well, so actually to get back to that, if you look at history, and we talked about this when we did our episode about Trump versus Biden, and I'm sure as we get closer to the general, like maybe October, something like that, we'll do another one of those episodes, but looking at Trump and Harris. It's worth noting on this day in 2020, Biden was leading by 7 points nationwide. And on this day in 2016, Clinton was leading by 6.
Yeah.
So Biden ultimately won the nationwide popular vote by 4.5, and Clinton won it by 2. So what you ended up seeing a 2.5 point, advantage in Trump's favor in terms of where the polling was 4 years ago.
Yeah.
And about a 4-point advantage in Trump's favor versus where it was 8 years ago.
Yeah. And I mean, and that's obviously very important to consider for a number of reasons, because it's not like Biden was running a phenomenal campaign. We were in the middle of COVID.
Actually,
right?
I believe it or not, I disagree with you. I think he actually did run a phenomenal campaign in 2020 because he stayed in his basement.
Here's what I will say. No, he ran the best campaign he possibly could have, which was not getting out there in front of people and talking.
That's what I mean.
Okay,
and that's what Kamala is doing now.
But the point is, he's not running a phenomenal campaign for me. When I define my terms on that, is it's a candidate that actually does have something to run on and does a very good job of articulating and running on it. Biden had to run from the campaign trail, and fortunately for him, he had both an environment where he could justify doing it and a very obedient and complicit media, not to mention the fact that a complicit bureaucratic state that was also working overtime to suppress information, which we're going to get to that a little bit later in the show. But one of the questions I want to ask here is why is this happening? So we've got an article up here, and this is Politico. So Politico is not exactly a right-wing news agency, but the title of the article is "We Dug into the 2024 Polling Crosstabs. What we found was stunning. Harris has made eye-popping gains with traditional core Democratic-based voters while also appealing to independents." All right, let's scroll down and see what they have to say. So according to Politico, Kamala Harris' surge in recent national polls is a stunning political turnaround. The story behind her burst of momentum, as told by the polling crosstabs, is even more remarkable. Less than a month ago, Democrats faced a grim election landscape. President Joe Biden faced trouble with independents and his base, and former President Donald Trump looks set to return to the White House. The ticket switch that saw Biden withdraw and Harris ascend to the Democratic nomination has reset the race by every campaign measure. All right, so go ahead and scroll down a little bit more. All right, this is the part that we want to look at here. Harris gained support across demographics compared to Biden. So Joe Biden's margin over Donald Trump in his pre-dropout polls compared to Kamala Harris' most recent polls, according to crosstabs of the highest rated pollsters. So overall, from Biden to Harris, 5% jump. For Democrats, a 7% jump. For independents, a 9% jump. For black voters, a 12% jump. Hispanic, a 6%. For the young, a 17% jump. For women, a 7% jump. For college-educated, a 3% jump. And for non-educated, a 5% jump.
I am actually not surprised by this for a couple reasons.
Yeah.
One, Harris is not the incumbent. And you have to understand that, like, a lot of people were looking at the contrast between Trump and Biden. They knew that Biden was the current incumbent president. They didn't like the way that things were. We've already seen polling that shows the overwhelming majority. It's like 2/3 of Americans think the country's on the wrong track.
Yeah.
So there were a lot of headwinds blowing against Biden's campaign. Even absent of the whole cognitive decline aspect that was highlighted in the debate, because let's be honest, Biden was trailing before the debate.
Oh yeah, he did a horrible job.
When we did our episode about making predictions for the general election, that was before the debate. And we were saying that Biden is in trouble and he's on track to lose. And I still stand by that. If he had stayed in the race, he was going to lose.
They were going to get rid of Biden.
And you were right.
And
you were right. And so, like, it is not at all surprising that overall Harris is doing better than Biden, because she's not the incumbent president.
Yeah.
Yes, she's the vice president. I totally understand she deserves blame for the policy disasters of the last 4 years. But the fact remains, though, she is not the president. And even though that doesn't necessarily color my thinking or your thinking, that does color the thinking of at least a fraction of the electorate. The other point is with Democrat voters. She overperforms with Democrats versus with the general electorate in terms of gains versus Biden. That's also not surprising. We knew there was a huge chunk of the Democratic Party that was upset with Joe Biden and upset with the DNC for basically gatekeeping any sort of opposition to Biden in the primary process. There were plenty of people that are identified on the left, Noah Smith, Nate Silver. These were people that were like pundits that are pretty prominent. They're not hardcore leftists, but they're on the left, right? You know, they're moderate progressives.
Yeah.
And they were saying things like, I'm not going to vote for Joe Biden because this was after the debate. They were saying things like, I'm not going to vote for Joe Biden because I'm upset at the Democratic Party for basically lying and gaslighting the public. Well, now that Biden's not the nominee, they've come back around and they're like, oh, I'm totally on board with Harris. I'm happy now. I'm satisfied. I'm going to vote straight Democrats. So that explains that second point. Same thing with independents. Independents were furious with Biden. It is not at all surprising that a chunk of independents, again, independents are basically 50-50 now at this point, but Trump was overwhelmingly winning them. It's not at all surprising that independents would also shift because they had an excuse to not vote for Biden, and that excuse has now been taken off the table. And it not at all should be surprising that minority voters, blacks, Hispanics, Asians, Jewish voters, they were in some ways being depressed by the Democratic base because all of them are Democratic leaning, some of them more than others. And again, let's be honest. Harris is, if she wins, she would be the first black female Indian minority president.
I want to talk about this for a second because I agree with you that it shouldn't be shocking at all that her bump with the black vote went up exponentially, especially with black women. Because there is something, I will tell you this, there is a divide between black men and black women in this country with respect to how they're voting. This is not to suggest that it's some massive divide where the majority of black men
We're not going to win a majority of black men.
That's not what's going on. But there is definitely division going on between black men and black women and how they vote. Hispanic men, Hispanic women. If you look at a lot,
and also white men and white women.
Well, yeah. If you look at a lot of the majority of like hardcore left wing activism, it is largely being driven by women. Now, the one that I think is the most interesting to me, and it's not a surprise, I just think it's the most interesting, is a 17% bump in the young. That is by far the single biggest bump that has happened, and I think that's for two reasons. One, I don't think young voters were fooled about. I don't think they were excited about Joe Biden. I think they hate Donald Trump. I don't think they were. They
were not fooled by Biden's cognitive decline.
They were not fooled by the media telling them that, oh no, Joe's in great shape. Like they did not buy that. Here's the other thing. I don't think they ever saw Joe as one of them. Joe was just a mechanism. He was a means to beat Donald Trump. I do think the younger voters are the more radical. The younger college-educated are the most radical. Now, the college-educated, side, we're always going to vote. They're going to vote Democrat. That's why I don't think you see a big bump there on the 3%. But when you see that combination of young and college-educated bumps, these are people that are rocking around like, Queers for Palestine, burning the American flag. These are
they're
people.
Also the DEI generation.
Yes. Well, that was my second point, right? The first point is they are far more radicalized when it comes to leftism. These are the people that consistently poll that they think communism is superior to capitalism, right? These are the people that when regularly polled say, well, yeah, we need more limitations on free speech. We need more limitations on X, Y, and Z. Like this is kind of the core of what the Democratic Party has done within our education system and especially higher ed for the last 60 to 70 years. The other thing on top of that, like you said, is that young voters, I feel, are far more convinced. So there's two types of young voters. You have the radicalized young voter that's burning the American flag on campus and, setting up these zones and the whole deal. Then you have the other younger voter that they're not necessarily like marching, but they want to fit in and they want to feel like they're on the right side. They're the sort of people that you show up to protests or rallies or something like that. You ask them questions like, what river and what sea, and they have no idea what you're talking about, right? They're the sort of people that you ask, like, what is your favorite Kamala Harris policy? It's like, oh, just everything. Just, she's just wonderful. Like, they have no clue.
They're just sheep.
They want to be in the in crowd. This is the in crowd within the environment that they occupy. And they place a high value because their entire lives, if you are under the age of 25, your entire life has been focused in one way or another, sometimes subtle, sometimes overt, into this oppressor-oppressed dynamic. And you have been essentially programmed to determine the virtue or the qualifications of a candidate based off of grievance. Mm-hmm. Right? The higher you are on the grievance scale,
or skin color,
that's a part of the grievance scale. The grievance scale is all rooted in things like sexual orientation. It's rooted in sex. It's rooted in skin color. It's rooted in, maybe to some degree economic circumstances, although they'll throw that in a heartbeat if it suits them. And it's also rooted in the idea of like trans or whatnot. So it's all about the oppressor versus oppressed dynamic. That's what they've grown up on. And the oppressor versus oppressed is largely categorized based off of those things: your skin color, your sexual orientation, how you identify, your loyalty toward leftist ideology.
Increasingly, the way that I look at it is that it is built around how far away from you are you from Nick and I. From the pinnacle of the obelisk of evil, right? How far away from you are you from straight white male or straight white Christian male, for that matter? The further away you are from that identifying, group or designation, the higher up you are on the sacred, order.
Wait, because their job is to elevate and protect and defend victims, to be a proper ally, to do all those other things. And so this is an easy question for them. Whether they're radicalized or not, it doesn't matter because this is how I fit in. And so the fact that you have such a massive jump over there, I think, is illustrated by the fact that, like you said, we live in a DEI culture now. They've grown up in a DEI culture where it's like, this is what we're supposed to do.
They're just hardwired this way.
Yes.
And the school system and social media, the media, everything has worked together to hardwire our kids and the younger generations to be like this. And I don't know what they classify as young, though. I'm not sure exactly the ages.
It's usually 18 to 29. So I just aged out of
you're not young
of this group. I'm not young anymore. But again, I'm not surprised that you see a 17-point jump among young voters for Harris, because again, they were depressed under Biden, and now the veil has kind of been lifted on that front, just like a lot of these other groups. But the overall point, though, with these crosstabs from this Politico article here, in terms of like the shift to the left, is that we now have a true race on our hands.
Yeah.
And I like. We've talked a little bit about the polling. We've talked about some of the past, and we've talked before on this podcast about how there's a bit of a shy Trump effect. Yeah. We were talking right before the cameras turned on about the extent to which there might be a shy Trump voter effect this cycle. And Tina and I disagree a little bit in the sense that Tina's bringing up the history that I agree with her on. That, Trump has historically overperformed his polling, in some cases significantly so.
Right.
Remember when I showed you guys Wisconsin polling from 2020, where it was showing that like Biden was going to win by like 7 or 8 points, and he ended up winning by like half a percentage point in Wisconsin? Yeah. That's a catastrophic failing. But we forget about it because, he still technically won Wisconsin. So like, Tina's right that Trump has historically overperformed his polling, and he's done even better in the swing states than he's done in the nationwide polling. But I think that this cycle, there's going to be less of a shy Trump effect than historically because of a variety of reasons.
That's assuming that shy Trump effect is what the problem was with the polling. Like, I'm not completely sure that accounted for all of that number difference.
Let's
and
go ahead. Sorry.
so
That's a good point. That's a good
I
point.
was just saying that they have gone through and tried to identify what was wrong with the polling. And I know for as long as I can remember, polling has always slightly favored the left. Like as far back as I can remember, just ever so slightly. And we just kind of assumed it's because the Republicans are out working and
So-
the people picking up the phone are the Democrats. We used to make that joke all the time. But now that's not, I mean, everyone's got a cell phone. They're calling your cell phone now. It's very, very different scenario. It doesn't really explain why Trump overperforms. Even when he loses, he's overperforming. He was down by 7.1 against Biden and way overperformed. He was down by over 6% against Hillary and then won. Now, you made the case that he did lose the popular vote, but he didn't lose the popular vote by 6 percentage points.
And he didn't lose it by 7. You're
right. And so it didn't make sense. And I'm not sure they've fixed the problem yet, but in case they have fixed the problem, I sure don't want to assume that, the polling's always wrong, so therefore we should just, we're fine. I don't know that we're fine. I mean, I'm optimistic, but I'm not sure we're.
Well, no, I think that is the right place to be right now in terms of, not being overly cocky in the sense that, we've got this in the bag, because we don't.
I want to look at one other poll here, and then I want to move into some questions about things like the convention and what that bump actually means. So this is the FDU poll finds race and gender push Harris above Trump nationally. Again, I don't think this is something for everybody that's looking at this and is maybe a little bit depressed that all the news agencies are out there going like, oh my gosh, Harris makes this a fantastic comeback. They were always going to do that, right? Like they were always going to say that. Part of what I think I had someone ask me the other day, like, aren't you concerned about that? I'm like, no. Why? Because I expected it. Right, I expected it. It's called pattern recognition. It happens every single time. It happens around this time, right? Convention and whatnot. And the dynamics in the race significantly changed overnight, which means you're gonna see poll shifts, relatively speaking, overnight. And so, race and gender push Harris above Trump nationally. Race considerations crater Trump support among non-white voters. Well, again, you replaced an old white guy with dementia. All right, with a younger, Black and Indian woman, right? Okay, that is probably going to have an impact with certain voting demographics. So Dickinson University, Madison, New Jersey, August 23rd, 2024. Voters nationally give Vice President and Democratic nominee Kamala Harris an edge over former President Donald Trump in November's election by a 7-point margin. But race and gender remain central to the vote when voters are made to think about the race or gender of the candidates. Harris leads grows substantially. So think about this. When voters are made to think about the race or gender of the candidates, Harris' lead grows substantially. When they're not, support is essentially tied. Harris is also helped by strong support among slightly less than half of men who reject traditionally masculine identities. Trump's strongest support is among men who hold traditionally masculine identities, while women and other men strongly favor Harris. So, right, like, this goes back into the whole when as early as elementary school, your children are being taught, whether it's overt or subtly, right? When everything is geared toward this idea of focusing on gender, on sex, on oppressor-oppressed dynamics. Even if they don't call it that, they don't call it oppressor-oppressed dynamics in your kid's 4th grade class. No. They talk about marginalized groups, people that have been historically marginalized, and again, I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't teach history. What I'm suggesting is that when the entire world that you swim in as a child is reinforced or is constantly bombarded with this narrative about marginalized groups and what you need to do to be an ally and what you need to do to support them and how do we make sure this never happens again, and isn't it so wonderful that we have the first this and the first this and the first this. You are programming kids to think a certain way about things, and it's not a neutral animosity toward slavery. It's not a neutral animosity toward racism. It's not a neutral favoring of equality before the law. That is not what's going on. If that's what was going on, I dare say almost nobody would have a problem with it. What's going on is you're actually being taught to think a certain way about how you deal with the problems of the past, how you deal with the problems of the patriarchy or income inequality. You're not just being told these things exist. Now let's analyze why. You're saying you're being told these things exist because of this.
And you're demonizing entire people groups to do it.
Yeah, because of this. And the moment you say, well, wait a second, I agree that this happened, but I don't know that it's because of this, you're automatically accused of denying that the things happened.
There has never been a nation or civilization in history that has built itself around oikophobia. Oikophobia is hatred of one's own culture and customs.
Yeah.
And that entirely explains modern day leftism, liberalism, progressivism, the Democratic Party as an institution. It is hatred of one's own culture. It is hatred of one's own history and customs and traditions. And again, there has never been a country or an empire or a civilization in history that has built itself around that. The Romans did not raise new generations of Romans to hate Rome.
Yeah.
How many generations of Romans were raised to be like, the Carthaginians were the real victims?
Yeah.
Like that was just never a thing. It was never, they were never teaching Roman kids that, Antiochus and the Seleucids were actually the good guys in the fight.
Well, there's two other things in this poll that I want to point out that are
Can I ask a question before you do that?
Yeah, go ahead.
Do you think, because it says when people were made to think about her race and gender, that everything improved. Do you think they used a push poll to do that?
They actually explain it.
Okay.
So there's two things I want to point out I think is interesting is that Harris has a strong lean among self-identified liberals, 87-10, progressives, 93-5, and moderates, 62-30. That I think is interesting when people say, oh, I'm a moderate, but it goes 62-30.
It's always 2-1 for the left when people identify as a moderate.
When people identify as a moderate, I just don't buy it anymore. I think it's ridiculous. I think it's one of those things like I'm the guy that I want to get invited to the cocktail party, and so I say the right things, but I also don't want to be perceived as partisan. Or there's, and you've pointed this out before, some might argue rather harshly, there's this kind of fake intellectualism associated with, oh, I'm a moderate.
Enlightened centrism.
I'm undecided. When in reality, it's like, no, you don't pay attention, or you haven't actually thought about this enough, because when you actually have distinctions that are this stark, it doesn't make sense for you to be sitting here going, well, I don't know if we should trans the kids, right? Like that doesn't make any sense.
The 2/3 of moderates that consistently vote for Democrats in every single election are what they really believe in is slow rolling the dissolving and destruction of society.
Hey guys, I don't want to get too far into that. I want to go to the next part. Trump leads among conservatives 76-19. Again, I'm really questioning when you have a question of, now again, it would be interesting to see if there was other people that, you might have, you do have people within conservative circles that say, I'm voting for Doug. Like, who's Doug? Oh, Doug's the leader of the, conservative part or whatever it is. Right. But again, 76-19, if you're really telling me that 19% of people that identify as conservative are not voting for Donald Trump, I find that shaky. The one, MAGA voters, 95-4. If you're saying you're a MAGA voter and you're not voting for Donald Trump, at some point you are lying, right? You're not being honest with the poll. I don't think. All right, but here's the part to your question about the whole race thing. And is it a push poll? And did they try to do this? To examine the effect of race and gender on vote choice, an experiment was embedded in the survey. In the survey, before being asked who they were supporting in the presidential race, respondents were given a list of 5 issues and asked which ones were important to their vote. The issues included tax policy, immigration policy, climate change, abortion, and foreign policy. But not all respondents got the same list. In addition to randomizing the order of the issues, 1/3 of respondents were given the race or ethnicity of the candidate as the last issue before the vote choice question, and 1/3 were given whether the candidate is a man or a woman as their last issue. The remaining 1/3 got all 5 of the issues in no particular order. So again, they did a test in here. Among voters who were not primed to think about the race or sex of the candidates, Harris and Trump are tied 47-48. When the list of issues mentions the sex of the candidates, Harris pulls ahead 52 to 42. And when the race of the candidates is mentioned, Harris holds a 14-point lead, 53 to 39, a 15-point shift away from the baseline condition. This is what is...
That shows you how hardwired our society's become.
Yes, this is deliberate. This is the part where when people say the Democrats are cheating, like, I want you to understand something, all right? Do I believe that there are poll workers that are stuffing ballot boxes in places like Philadelphia? Yes. But that right there, that sort of hardwiring into voters where they are automatically programmed to believe as soon as I find out the gender or the ethnicity of the candidate, that is supposed to impact my vote away from all the policy questions that I already answered. So I'm with Trump on this. Oh, wait, it's a woman? It's a minority woman? It's a person of color? Well, okay, well, now I got to shift significantly. Really? That is social conditioning. Right there. That is exactly what that is. That is social conditioning. If you wanted to get as far away as you could from the Martin Luther King content of your character versus color of your skin, that's it. The left has been on a mission to remove it from the whole content of the character aspect and to move it toward what's your gender, what's your skin color, because that's going to tell me whether you're oppressor or oppressed. And I've got to be, that's either how I'm supposed to identify, or I have to be a good ally. So even though I have problems with immigration, even though I don't agree with them on foreign policy, even though I have issues on all of these other incredibly relevant topics, which actually have something to do with the nature of the question I'm being asked, I'm going to make all of that subservient to politics surrounding race and sex.
It was always going to end this way. Mm-hmm. And the reason why is because we do not have a shared moral and philosophical foundation for a country. And so what is happening to the United States is in some ways a more mitigated and not yet further along course of what is happening in the United Kingdom at the moment. Remember how the UK just had a general election a month ago on July 4th. And Labour won in a landslide in that election. But what was interesting is that there are plenty of ethnic enclaves within the UK, like Birmingham and Slough and stuff like that, where British voters are an overwhelming minority. They're in Birmingham, I think, and in London itself, British voters are only like a third of the electorate. The rest of it are mostly foreigners from like Southeast Asia, like Pakistan or Bangladesh or India, other places too, Africa, the Middle East. And what certain candidates realized is that with the way the voting system in the UK worked is that even though like Muslim voters in Birmingham are only, like 3% of the population, not just Birmingham, right? In general, they're only like 3% of the population because they're so clustered in certain areas. They can just vote for their own candidates. They don't need to actually vote Labour. They don't need Labour at all. They're going to vote their own people in. They voted in pro-Gaza candidates that literally campaigned on supporting Hamas, and they got like 5 seats in Parliament. What happened in the UK was you basically had sectarianism take hold within politics in the UK. Now, it didn't take hold in like the countryside where it's still 90%, native British voters, but it took place in cities where native British voters are the minority. And historically, these minority voters in places like Birmingham were loyal Labour voters until they realized they don't need to vote for Labour anymore. They can elect their own candidates. Yeah. And so they voted Labour out in these strongholds that used to be left-wing strongholds. And so what has happened in the UK is you saw an emergence of sectarianism and a dangerous form of sectarianism that's fueled in some cases by like radical Islamism. Well, the same thing is starting to happen in the United States, but it's playing out differently. We don't have these like ethnic enclaves. Now we do in some cases, right? Like Dearborn, Michigan has a very large like Arab population. Yeah. There's some parts of the country that are, like overwhelmingly Hispanic, like on the southern border, right? Or in Miami. But by and large, we don't have these like ethnic enclaves where it's almost like a state within a state where, there's no integration or anything like that. What we instead have is we don't have a shared moral and philosophical foundation. And if you had a moral and philosophical foundation, a shared set of principles and beliefs, you could get away with with this,
Yeah.
because you wouldn't have people voting based on race or sex, because it would be like, well, we all have a shared set of values and principles that we believe, and those are going to influence my voting decisions. And it's not going to be race or sex that influences it. It's going to be those values that influence it. But when you strip those values away, what you end up having is everything devolves into sectarianism. Everything devolves into identitarianism. Everything devolves into questions about race or sex or gender or any of these other immutable characteristics of individuals, because there is no shared foundation through which you can adjudicate these differences.
Yeah.
The only way that you can adjudicate these differences is through dividing people based on race, dividing people based on gender, dividing people based on sexuality or skin color or ethnicity or religion or any of these other characteristics, because again, there is no foundation.
What I think it's an excellent point. I think it's also important to understand what is to the direction you were going. What is the logical outworking of a political philosophy or movement which bases so much of what they're attempting to do based off of skin color, gender, and things of that nature?
It's more complicated than that.
Well, wait a second. Let me finish what I'm saying.
Okay.
Now, I believe it's leftist, and I believe that these are all mechanisms for a leftist ideology, because when you read Marx, when you read Gramsci, when you read, Herbert Marcuse, like you see what's going on here, right? Like there is an underlying philosophy which isn't necessarily tied to race or sex, but these end up becoming useful mechanisms in order to tear down what you currently have, set up a counterculture, and then reinvent it all within your own image. But the thing that also needs to be taken into account of these things don't always just happen in a vacuum. They do at times take on their own objectives. That is what Labour and the left in the UK is figuring out, right? And some of these enclaves where all of a sudden you're getting semi-militant Islamists elected to office, they are happy to work with Labour in order to get power. When they have it, do you think there's going to be a bunch of trans flags on the streets? Like, do you honestly believe that if, again, the Islamist, I'm not talking about someone that's just, that is a Muslim, that's their religion.
The pro-Hamas.
It's not necessarily their politics,
Yeah.
but it is their religion, right? And Islamist, which does not separate the two at all, which sees their religious duty as to advance it either through the sword or through politics or whatever else. When they get in charge, they're not like, oh, well, you know what? The left was here for us, and now it's time for us to be here for the left. That is not how this goes down. That is not how this goes down. And that's the part where I think sometimes the left miscalculates on what they can utilize, because the problem with the direction that they're currently going is when you make everything ostensibly about race or sex or identity. Right? Now, again, you might be using it as a tool to set up a particular political philosophy you want, but when you use that as the tactic, there's going to be some people that join on that they don't care about your other tactic. They buy into, yes, this is all about race.
I'm going to do
Or,
what's
yes,
best for my in-group, basically.
Yes, this is all about sex or whatever it is. And they might not be willing to go along with your long-term plan for reordering society. They may just see you as a useful tool for their own objectives. But the point I wanted to make is this. There is no world where you can create the sort of society which ignores the pressing issues which ostensibly we should be able to come to some sort of logical response to based off of traditions or reason or logic or the scientific method or evidence. Nope, we're going to throw that out and we're going to prioritize race or sex. When you start to create a society around that, you create a perverse incentive for yourself, because now it's all about how do I undermine whoever's currently here. Because if you're white, right, and Christian, or if you're white, Christian, and male and heterosexual, and I can't convert you to either atheism or transgenderism or LGBT, whatever it is, if I can't get you into my camp, there is no reasoning or negotiating with you. You are bad by virtue of your skin color. That's the world they've now created. You are to be disadvantaged. You are to be given a diminished place within society because of, past evils, real or perceived, for which you had nothing to do with. But it doesn't matter, because that's the marker we're now using to decide good guy versus bad. That is their version of the friend-enemy distinction. And so the perverse incentive for them is, well, of course they have to mitigate, diminish, demean, a whole sector of the population which they can never truly be allies with under the worldview that they've created. the perverse incentive they've created for the other side is what happens when the other side says, fine, if this is the world that you've created and this is the new rules of the game, well, then I guess I'm going to fight along the lines of race or sex or identity instead of shared values or a logical process for peacefully adjudicating differences.
Well, I mean, that is okay. So everything you said there reminded me of this right here. Yeah. That is exactly what is taking place right now, Nick, is that identitarianism is taking hold because the left has created an incentive structure through which there is no other option. I mean, short of you just not playing by, they have set the rule book, and you're a fool to not play by the rules anymore unless you want to lose. And so you should not be surprised when you get things like this chart right here that shows young men are leaving the Democratic Party. 18 to 29-year-old young men who identify as Democrats have been plummeting since 2016. Before 2016, an absolute majority of young men, like all young voters, identified as being on the left. That was a long tradition that goes back hundreds of years, that younger people tended to be more liberal than older people who tended to be more conservative. And the whole, adage that as you got older, you would get more conservative with time. And so it was not at all surprising that younger men, just like all young voters, for the vast majority of the last 100+ years, identified as being more left-wing than right-wing. And so in 2016, an absolute majority of 18 to 29-year-old young men identified as Democrats. Today, it is 39%. There's some more damning stuff here. This is, will young men vote Democrat in 2024? Percent identifying as Republicans. This is young men identifying as Republicans now. In 2013, it was 38%. Man, back when I was a young man, I was an absolute minority there. And you see how it was like hovering under 40% until 2018, and then it was in the mid 40s, and now it's almost 50%. And what has happened, and I mean, again, just evidence after evidence, right? We've talked about this chart before about the divide between young men and young women in terms of political and philosophical ideology. Same thing with party preference. Again, there's evidence upon evidence upon evidence of this.
Well, and to your point, because sorry, go ahead.
And the conclusion here is that what has happened is the friend-enemy distinction, which at some point we will do a full-blown podcast on, I'm sure, is taking hold within the right and within groups within the right that never even identified as being on the right. And the only reason they're shifting to the right now is because they have now realized this group of people, the left, labor, the Democratic Party, doesn't matter your country, right? Just progressive movements in general, have labeled me the enemy. Why? Because I'm a male. Why? Because I'm straight. Why? Because I'm white. And so therefore, I'm now going to uplift these categorizations and make them a part of my identity because I have to, because I need to prioritize my in-group against the out-group, because the out-group is saying they hate me and they're saying they want to do harm to me. And if you want evidence of it, I've got evidence for it. I remember watching when Democrats took control of the Virginia legislature in 2019, and they passed a bill that said, we will actively discriminate against men, against white people, when it comes to government contracts for jobs, and we will prioritize giving state funds to people who are minority or women business owners against business owners that are white or male. When I saw that, I was like, "There's no way." This is back when I was a derpy libertarian. I was like, "There's no way the progressive enlightened left are gonna actively discriminate against people based on race and sex." I thought they're against this stuff. Nope, they passed it unanimously. Every Democrat voted for this bill. That really told me something. That told me that, oh no, they are practicing a friend-enemy distinction, and they've declared certain people to be the enemy. And you should not at all be surprised when those groups that they've declared to be an enemy start to band together and actually uplift their own immutable characteristics, for good or for ill, in order to defend themselves against that friend-enemy distinction. And this is why I'm saying that sectarianism and identitarianism is taking hold not just on the left, but on the right as a counter-reaction to the left's application of that friend-enemy distinction against them.
Can I ask you a question? Do you think, years down the road after they've gone this course for a very long time, do you think, how sometimes there are people groups, voting demographics that will vote in block? It's pretty much expected that this group of people will vote in block because of, various reasons, right?
Yeah.
Do you think men will become one of those type of voting blocks where it will be now the male vote?
I don't think it'll be as stark. So let's back up a little bit and let's give the most generous explanation for some of this as we possibly can, especially when it comes to like different minority groups and whatnot. There is a time within living memory of a lot of the people that I serve with in the General Assembly, to where black people were openly discouraged, legally prevented from doing things by virtue of their skin color. If you find yourself in a culture, in a situation where by virtue of your skin color, you were put at a legal disadvantage or you're put in danger as a result of it, it is absolutely to be expected that that group of people will band together in order to defend themselves, regardless of what their other differences may be. Because ultimately the hierarchy of concern goes with our physical safety, not getting beat by the police, not doing stuff like that. So that makes sense. When you develop a culture, when a culture develops around that, and you start to make advancements within society, right? And then all of a sudden, Jim Crow laws are repealed, they're overturned. But it's not just the legal component too, right? There's a major cultural shift with a vast majority of like young people today have no real recollection of what it was like to live in a world where that was prominent, like legally sanctioned and encouraged within society. Because for as long as I've been alive, right? And we'll tell everyone on Thursday how long I've been alive. For as long as I've been alive, I grew up in an environment and was taught, and this was reinforced within my culture, within the movies I watch, within the music I listen to, within everything. Like I'm so tired of listening to liberals and leftists claim like, oh, it's worse now. It's just more subtle. Screw you, dude. Screw you. All right. The state is not legally, in fact, it's gone the opposite direction. They're giving you economic advantages and preferred placement within areas in order to make up for past discrimination.
Yeah, how many Tulsa riots are taking place? Wait, the Summer of Love in 2020.
Yeah. So please,
but in reverse.
Please spare me this. Like I am not denying that things were bad. I think it's ridiculous for people to suggest that it's worse now, or that we're on our.
It's insanity to say that.
Or we're on our 47th first good step, right? Good first step. Like I'm so tired of that. But if you've also created an environment where the way that you attain power and prominence within a group is based off of your activism surrounding those issues, you will always have a category, you always have a group that will always look for that battle to fight, right? If all of your heroes, okay, let me give you an example. If all of your heroes, if you sat there and you listened to stories about how grandpa defeated, the fascists or whatever it is, you develop this idea of, that's me. I want to defeat, fascists or anybody that believes that way or whatnot. What happens when they're defeated? Right now, a reasonable person recognizes, well, that evil manifests itself in various ways, in different ways, and that you should, find other ways that you can do that. But a more lazy approach is just to go back to the old enemy that has theoretically already been defeated and insist that that enemy's still there and still as prominent as ever, and we still need to organize based off of these things because that's been the source of political power, right? And so I think it's important.
Now everything gets labeled as fascist.
And I think it is important to recognize that part of the sin of genuinely institutionalized racism, right? Legal codes which reinforce racism. Part of the sin of that is that you create those cultural conditions, which the consequences of which far outlive the policies themselves. And what we have right now too is another ideology, right? Leftism, right? A Marxist interpretation of reality, which globbed on to elements of the civil rights movement and have used it as a mechanism to push their own agenda completely separate from any sort of genuine concern about the value of individual humans or whatnot. It's been a mechanism. It's been a tool in order to go in a particular direction, and that's it.
This goes back to my point about how the sectarianism and identitarianism that you brought up with, and I had not seen this poll, by the way, that showed the breakdown between sex and gender and how that influences the presidential outcome. And it's really fascinating. And I think that part of the reason that we're seeing this emergence is because we've we've stripped away the unity of purpose, the unity of philosophy. It goes back to this debate that not debate. It goes back to this podcast that we did several months ago that was a controversial title where you titled it "Diversity is not our strength."
Yeah.
And your point is that no, actually, unity of purpose is the strength. Mm-hmm. Unity of values, unity of philosophy and of worldview is the strength. And when you have a diversity of materials that are used to build a bridge, right? A single purpose in the sense we're going to build a bridge. There's a strength there, right? You know, iron can do something that concrete can't do, that steel can't. That makes sense. But when you strip that unity out, well, you just have a bunch of building materials, but you're not actually using it for any single purpose. And so what you end up getting is that when you prioritize diversity above, again, unity of set of values or worldview or all sorts of things, political, theological, philosophical unity, you will always get identitarianism and sectarianism as a result. And so the leftist project of uplifting these principles at the sake of these other principles are the reason that we are now entering this quite frankly, I think, dangerous set of circumstances right now, where you're going to see more circumstances where, quite frankly, if you're a white man, you should not be voting for the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party hates you. They have made it abundantly clear in law, in places where they control things, like in Virginia briefly, that they despise you. They will discriminate against you. They will actively discriminate against you. I've said it before. When they use immutable characteristics like white male, and they use it as an insult rather than a designation of somebody, that should tell you something. You should start noticing some patterns there.
Well, and what they're doing is they're creating the very conditions that they claim to want to fight against on behalf of other groups. If I could sum up the whole diversity, unity, strength thing, it works like this. Diversity of skill and competence toward a unified purpose is a strength. Arbitrary diversity without a unified purpose only sows division. It sows infighting. It sows sectarianism. So that's the problem. But again, it's these turns of phrase, it's these cliches that the left has become so good at. Oh, diversity is our strength. No, it isn't. It depends entirely on the context. You're right. If I want to build a house, the diversity of the skill sets required in order to do that effectively toward that common purpose of building a house is absolutely necessary and a strength, right? But if we don't have a common purpose, building a house, and you've selected your diversity based off of arbitrary characteristics as opposed to skill sets which are necessary toward the purpose, then you got nothing. You're not going to be able to build anything. You're not going to be able to do anything. All you're going to be able to do is sit there and fight with one another based off of those arbitrary distinctions. And that's where we're at. And the question that you have to ask yourself, and this is something James Lindsay hit on this really hard lately. He goes, stop saying wokeism is insane. It's not insane. It's doing exactly what it's designed to do, and that's destroy what currently exists. Because they don't want it. They want to rebuild on the top of it. Well, they don't want to modify it, right? They don't want what currently exists. They want to destroy it.
It reminds me of that Karl Marx quote that you read off to me right before we turned the cameras on.
Yeah.
What was it again?
Oh, gosh.
You don't need the whole thing. But
essentially that it's from Mephistopheles and Faust, and it's this quote where essentially says that everything that exists deserves to be destroyed. And that was one of Karl Marx's favorite quotes. He said it all the time. This is why people that think that, Marx was all just about helping the working person or the poor. No, he had an objective, and that objective was not just rooted in nihilism. It was rooted in something of a genuine animosity toward civilization, toward being.
It's what Jordan Peterson's quote was, which is that leftism, and it's probably the best quote from Jordan Peterson of all time, where he said that leftism is a rebellion against God for the crime of being.
Yeah. Well, listen, we've got it. We've the reason why we spent so much time actually talking about the philosophical importance of this and this particular poll too is because it indicates something. And again, the gaming the system or the cheating or the influence in elections or whatnot is so much worse and more deeply ingrained than just stuffing a ballot box or anything else. It really is rooted in the social conditioning that has taken place through our institutions of education, through our institutions of entertainment, which have taught people to prioritize immutable characteristics over both a process for adjudicating differences peacefully and addressing very real issues which impact everyone. Right? That's no longer the primary consideration. If you want to be accepted within your group, if you want to be able to achieve that virtuous standing that you so desire, and that conditions have been created in order to cause you to desire, then you must set aside all of these other things in service to this greater thing, which is race and identity politics. I want to go into two other aspects here real quick, and then we're going to get into some predictions on what we think is going to happen over the next 2 months, right? Because 2 months in a presidential year election is a virtual eternity. There's so much stuff that can happen between now and then. And so we're gonna give you some predictions based off of the latest polling and what we're seeing right now. But one of the things I wanted to point out, and this kind of goes into the part we talked about before. What are the ways that our elections are really being manipulated in ways that have massive impact? And the Zuckerberg revelation is pretty significant. I'm going to actually read off this.
This is a crazy headline.
Letter. Yeah, Zuckerberg admits Biden administration pressured Facebook to censor COVID content, says it was wrong to suppress the post-Hunter laptop coverage. I'm going to read this. I'm going to read off this letter because I think it deserves to be heard in its entirety. And what I think is interesting about this is that he sent this to Jim Jordan in response to questions that were being asked from the Committee on the Judiciary. Because once again, we were all told this isn't happening. This isn't happening. It's all your imagination. All these outlets are doing is preventing misinformation, or, using a reasonable interpretation in order to prevent hate speech, or people are all going to die or whatnot. Or all they're doing is they're making sure that the Russians can't interfere in our election by ensuring, because we had 52 members of the intel community sign a letter saying that this was all Russian disinformation, the Hunter laptop. So here's what Mark Zuckerberg, head of Meta,
I want to know why all 52 of those have not been fired and brought up on charges.
Well, a lot of them were former.
Most of them were former. They weren't actively involved in it. They were former. What they should do is probably have their security clearances taken. But anyways, Chairman Jordan, I appreciate the committee's interest in content moderation on online platforms. As you are aware, Meta has produced thousands of documents as part of your investigation and made a dozen employees available for transcribed interviews. Further to our cooperation with your investigation, I welcome the opportunity to share what I've taken away from this process. There's a lot of talk right now around how the U.S. government interacts with companies like Meta, and I want to be clear about our position. Our platforms are for everyone. We're about promoting speech and helping people connect in a safe and secure way. As a part of this, we regularly hear from governments around the world and others with various concerns around public discourse and public safety. In 2021, senior officials from the Biden administration, including the White House, repeatedly pressured our teams for months to censor certain COVID-19 content, including humor and satire, and expressed a lot of frustration with our teams when we didn't agree. Ultimately, it was our decision whether or not to take content down, and we own our decisions, including COVID-19 related changes we made to our enforcement in the wake of this pressure. I believe the government pressure was wrong, and I regret that we were not more outspoken about it. I also think we made some choices that, with the benefit of hindsight and new information, we wouldn't make today. Like I said to our teams at the time, I feel strongly that we should not compromise our content standards due to pressure from any administration in either direction, and we're ready to push back if something like this happens again. In a separate situation, the FBI warned us about a potential Russian disinformation operation about the Biden family in Burisma in the lead up to the 2020 election. That fall, when we saw a New York Post story reporting on corruption allegations involving then Democratic presidential nominee Joe Biden's family, we sent that story to fact checkers for a review and temporarily demoted it while waiting for a reply. It's since been made clear that the reporting was not Russian disinformation, and in retrospect, we shouldn't have demoted the story. We've changed our policies and process to make sure this doesn't happen again. For instance, we no longer temporarily demote things in the U.S. while waiting for fact checkers. Apart from content moderation, I want to address the contributions I made during the last presidential cycle to support electoral infrastructure. The idea here was to make sure local election jurisdictions across the country had the resources they needed to help people vote safely during a global pandemic. I made those contributions through the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. They were designed to be nonpartisan, spread across urban, rural, and suburban communities. Still, despite the analysis I've seen showing otherwise, I know that some people believe this work benefited one party over the other. My goal is to be neutral and not play a role one way or the other, or to even appear to be playing a role, so I don't plan on making a similar contribution this cycle. So, a couple of things here. He addressed three main things. One was the misinformation about COVID, and specifically the administration pushing, the FBI pushing them to remove information about COVID, remove information about the Hunter Biden laptop, and then he also addressed the money that he's given to, help with, making it easier for people to vote, when in reality, a lot of this was used and funneled off into groups that had partisan inclinations, not just nonpartisan ones. He makes a comment here, and I want people to understand something. And this is where he says, ultimately, it was our decision whether or not to take content down, and we own our decisions, including COVID-19 related changes we made to our enforcement in the wake of this pressure. When your friend or when your peers pressure you, when maybe when a sponsor or a donor pressure you, that's pressure. You could lose something, right? You could lose something if you don't do it. Maybe you could lose a friendship. Maybe you could lose audience. Maybe you could lose money or donations. When the federal government pressures you to do something, there is always behind the scenes this idea that if we don't do this, they're going to make things very bad for us in a way that literally no one else could.
Yep.
As much as you might not like a rich person, as much as you might not like your employer, as much as you might not like your landlord, you know what none of them can do? Confiscate your property and throw you in jail. Right? They can't execute you. The government gets to do all those things. And when a government that has the spying capability and capacity that this one does, when it is repeatedly now demonstrated that it will go after political enemies, when it will do so either through the light of day, through legislation, through picking and choosing winners and losers, through subsidization, rent seeking, or favorable regulations to one group over another, when it will go after you through lawfare and threaten to take down your company, bankrupt you, and send you to jail for a considerable amount of your life, when it will do all of those things, and then they show up on your door and say, we would really like you to do this. Yeah, you're right. It is your decision. And I'm glad you owned up to making that decision, but let's not pretend. Let's not pretend that what was going on here, that what was not going on here, because this was not just some subtle recommendation from somebody. This was made under the threat of a body which has the only legal authority to use violence and coercion in order to achieve its desired outcomes. Mm-hmm. That's what it is. If you want to know why so many of us have been concerned about the increasing scope and power of government, it all goes back. It all goes back to Jefferson. The government strong enough, big enough, powerful enough to give you the things that you think you want is strong enough, big enough, and powerful enough to take it away from you. And if you think you're going to be protected by due process of law, by people within the government who increasingly believe they are above it, believe that they have a higher moral calling that they answer to, which if it means they have to subvert the laws it's currently written, it means that they have to subvert the Constitution. Well, that's all in service to the greater good. Don't you understand that this other person is a threat to democracy? Don't you understand that this other person is engaging in hate speech? Don't you understand that this other person is inciting people toward violence? Don't you understand that if this other person is allowed to speak, if this other person is allowed to share their concerns, if this other person is allowed to continue in the way that they have chosen, it's a threat. It's violence. And so, of course, we have to use the full force of government to shut that person down, to arrest them, to prosecute them, to destroy their business. Does anybody at this point honestly feel that we don't have a significant number of people, both within the government and elected office, and especially the bureaucratic state, that absolutely see the government, the federal apparatus, as the very mechanism they're supposed to be using to achieve these ends?
And it's happening across the entire West right now.
We still see people. The FBI is still kicking in doors of people who happen to be in D.C. on January 6th.
They're kicking in the doors of people who weren't even in D.C.
January 6th. I'm going to bring this up because it just happened in my district. We had an individual, from what I understand, and I'm still learning the details, so I'm not going to mention the individual by name, because something could come out that demonstrates that maybe the federal government and law enforcement had sufficient evidence to do what they did. But the story that I have right now is that a constituent of mine who had done combat tours in Iraq and Afghanistan had come home, dealt with issues like PTSD and whatnot in order to overcome some of the things that happen to people in combat. who is, by all accounts, a law-abiding citizen, no additional criminal record that I'm aware of, no online presence would suggest that this person has ever engaged in deliberate attempts to overthrow the United States government or to threaten violence against someone. At least that's the information I have. But because this person was present on January 6th, didn't go into the Capitol, but present on January 6th, and because the government is alleging that he used violence or engaged in violent activity, right? And apparently they have video. We'll see what happens. Apparently they showed up with a full tactical team, multiple, the black SUVs, the whole deal, in order to go get this guy. Now, it didn't matter that he had family over, that he wasn't like resisting anything. He didn't give any indication that he was going to resist. And I'm someone that generally gives the benefit of the doubt to law enforcement when they have to go into a seemingly or potentially dangerous situation in order to operate. But I'm looking at what happened with this, and I'm like, wait a second, this was 4 years ago. You've had this data for 4 years. Did you just now find it? Did you just now build a sufficient case? Or are you really saying that this sort of a force was necessary in order to do this? Maybe it was. Or maybe there's a political incentive to treat anybody that was there as if they are some sort of legitimate threat, insurrectionist, traitor to the country. We need the American people to know just how close we were to losing our republic. That's right, because a bunch of people who I guarantee you probably own a lot of guns showed up to launch an insurrection and just left all the guns at home. Right? Is that what's going on here? And now we're being told that this is the greatest threat. This is what we had to pull the FBI off of hunting down human traffickers. This is what we had to pull off law enforcement from doing all of those other tasks that most Americans would agree should probably take priority over a grandmother that was arrested and has to have an ankle bracelet because she walked into the Capitol on January 6th, quietly said a prayer, and left. But no, that's the priority. Do you think that's a priority because grandma's a real threat to the republic, or do you think it's a priority because it fits far more neatly into the leftist narrative about what's going on?
No, the real threat is that grandma is a threat to the Democratic Party. She is a threat to progressivism and liberalism and leftism and all of its manifestations and cultural Marxism. And this is not just happening in the United States. It has happened in Canada. We saw what happened with the Canadian trucker convoy. The country shut down all the way into 2022, and the response from people is, no more of the mandates, no more of the shutdowns. I'm going to make my voice heard in Ottawa. And what do? You get arrested for it. You get your bank account frozen for it. And you know whose bank account was also frozen was Nigel Farage. Yeah. Right before he decided to run for office for the Reform Party, he was debanked. And you know what also happened in the UK recently? They're starting to throw people in prison. This story just came out a week ago. They threw this 22-year-old in prison for waving an English flag in front of a government building protesting the immigration policies. This was right after the stabbing that took place that killed 3 little girls. It wasn't enough that they were arresting people that were looting the local Gregs. I'm fine with that. If you're destroying private property, absolutely. Although I do find it interesting that the only people that ever get punished for apparently destroying private property are when they're supposedly doing it for a right-wing cause, not a left-wing cause. We saw that in 2020. And you know what else they're doing? In Ireland, you had a similar situation. There was a stabbing incident that took place in Ireland earlier this year, and there was a huge amount of protests. There was also one that happened last year in November. And there were a huge amount of protests, and the response from the Irish government wasn't, maybe we should actually listen to the public that are upset with the policies that we're pushing. The response was, we're going to ram through a hate speech bill. Yeah. We're just going to make it illegal for you to protest these policies that we oppose. The same thing happened in Germany. We're the second most popular party in Germany right now in terms of public approval polling for the next election that's supposed to take place in 2025, AfD. They're talking about banning it. Who knew that you could just ban a political party when they become too popular because they're a threat to your political worldview? Yeah. And they're denying things like gun permits to members of the party. Why? Because they're apparently a threat to democracy. I can't think of any better way to radicalize normal people who might just happen to disagree with your left-wing cultural Marxist worldview than to throw them in prison, debank them, make it illegal for them to wave their own country's flag in front of a government building, deny them gun permits, and outlaw their political parties. You want to turn people into actual radicals? Do those 5 things right there, and you're starting to see the results of it. As James Lindsay said, people's patience is starting to wane thin right now.
Oh, we have gotten to the point where it's like, I'm not radicalized. You're coming after me. You're coming after me.
It goes back to the friend-enemy distinction.
You are coming after me with the full force of government. I didn't ask you to do this. I wasn't actively going out and creating conditions in which it required you to do this. You decided I was your enemy, so you came after you. And now that I'm responding, I'm a radical. No, you're the one that brought this.
Absolutely.
You're the one that showed up to the fight. Now that I'm fighting back, you're offended. Well, screw your offense. I don't care anymore. Offense is not a substitute for an argument. And we're done. We're just done. But bringing it back to all of this, because I want to get to the part where we talk about what do we actually do about it. So first and foremost, you need to understand that, again, your kids are being conditioned in ways that you cannot possibly imagine unless you're actually studying this topic or you're actively involved in your kids' schooling in a way that you are legally not permitted to be. Just understand this. Whenever they call it a public park is something that I can go to right now because it's a public park. A public school is not something that you can just walk into as a parent, right? They're not going to just let you come in and sit in whatever you want and watch what's being taught. They're not going to let you do that. Maybe under certain conditions you'll get to, but they believe they should be able to hide information from you. You're the real, the presumption is not that the school or the government is the threat. No, you as the parent are the potential threat if you don't affirm the things that the government thinks you should affirm. So if you don't understand that the reason why voters will sit there and when they say, here's all the issues, who are you voting for? Oh, I'm voting for the one that takes these positions. Did you know that's a white guy? Oh, never mind. Do you understand that you have to create conditions? You have to manipulate conditions to get voters, and it's predominantly young ones, that the moment when you tell them the issues, they're like, oh yeah, I think this way. And then when you tell them the skin color or the sex or whatever else that the left has prioritized, all of a sudden it's, oh yeah, no, never mind. Never mind, I don't support that person, I support this person. That's conditioned. That's not natural. That's conditioned. And it's the complete antithesis of what the civil rights movement, what the founding philosophy of the Declaration of Independence was supposed to be about. And it's because they don't care. They have a different vision for the world. This is currently beneficial toward that vision. And so this will be what you're required to repeat. And this will be what you're required to engage in if you want to be accepted. Period. The end. It's not that difficult. Again, like James Lindsay said, it's not that wokeism is insane. It works exactly the way it's designed to work. And so start recognizing it that way. And to the extent that you have power, you need to start making some decisions with respect to how you want your children educated. What sort of influence are you going to be in that process? And what sort of other influences are you allowing to be involved in that process? I would be horrified if my child told me, well, I'm voting for this person based off of their skin color or their sex. Like, what about the positions? Oh yeah, I actually don't agree with them on the positions, but this is the way that I demonstrate I'm a good person. I would be horrified by that. And again, don't fool yourself into believing that the school is ever going to come out and say, oh yeah, that's exactly what we're teaching our kids race and identity. Your kids race and identity. They're not going to tell you that. They're going to teach you, they're going to tell you that they're teaching about these struggles of marginalized people throughout time and how they rose up and how they were overcome that. Something that nobody has any problems with until you realize that the solutions that they're offering are all pointing in one direction, and they make the solutions that they're offering, which should be separate from the conditions, which should be separate from the historical events. They're taking their solutions and they're making them synonymous to where if you don't agree with one, then you don't acknowledge the other. And that is a tactic. That is a manipulative tactic. But that's exactly what's going on. And that's how you create conditions like this. You don't got to stuff a ballot box if you've already brainwashed them. And they understand the long-term benefits of that. The question is are we going to wake up to it? Are we going to recognize that if your version of fighting for the schools is you went to a school board meeting and you yelled a little bit and you voted differently, but then nothing changed with respect to the curriculum or the conditions in the environment that your kids go into, nothing changed, and you said, well, I did my part. Okay, well then guess what? Don't be surprised. Just don't. Don't be surprised. Sorry, but that little hard truth is just what it is. The second thing I would say is that what Zuckerberg revealed here is that there are a lot of people within the bureaucratic state that are making this sort of thing possible. This is not just elected officials. This is more often than not unelected bureaucrats which have the power of authority. Not because they wrote the laws, but because a politician wrote a broad law that went into effect, and now they have the ability to promulgate regulations because, after all, don't we want the experts to be the ones that are deciding how this law will actually be enforced? The reason why this election cycle is so important, and the reason why anybody that wants to do this thing where they say, okay, well, hey, it doesn't matter because they'll cheat, like, dude, shut up. Honestly, you finally have, and there are plenty of things about Trump's past. There are plenty of things about certain positions that he takes on certain issues that are very important to me that I don't agree with. I am very pro-life. But the issue that we're facing right now is that for the first time in my lifetime, we finally have a presidential ticket to include both the president and the vice president that understand that the real threat that we're facing right now is an unelected bureaucratic state that believes it has the moral authority to govern you without your consent. And if you're not willing to significantly work on dismantling that, if you don't understand that that is your primary focus, I got nothing for you at this point. Because you might be able to go in and maybe if you get the Congress that you need, if you actually have people that are willing to vote on difficult issues, then yes, you're going to be able to make some temporary improvements, which will all be gone in 4 years. Or 8 years. Or you'll pass it in law all day long, and guess what'll happen? The bureaucratic state will be like, yeah, we don't think so. And they'll slow roll it. And they'll take you to court. And you'll be 3 years into this administration and realize that we had the votes. If only that was all that mattered. So no, the reason why I am so adamant this year, the reason why I will tell people, and the reason why, look, I always tell people, if you're watching this right now, you're the political one in your friend group. And you probably got a lot of people that share your values who are frustrated. Maybe they're black-pilled. Maybe they think, what does it matter? And all I'm going to tell you is, for the love of God, I want to save my country, and I don't want my country to descend into the direction that I see it going. Because there are certain lines that if the government crosses, there's certain lines that if people cross, I'm not going with them, and I will resist that. I will resist that. I don't want it to get to that point. I have a certain amount of faith that because of everything that has gone on over the last 7.5 years, that this time around Trump understands that if he gets into office and he decides to work with all the same little establishment hacks, regardless of their political party, who have built up their entire infrastructure based off of working within the system that currently exists, as opposed to fighting back against certain institutions, certain rules, certain regulations, certain realities, which have turned us into a constitutional republic, turned us from that into a massive bureaucratic state that gets to intervene in almost every aspect of our lives. If you don't understand that that has to be tackled and it has to be the main focus of your energy, right? And he does. He realizes it. He realizes it in a way I don't think anybody else has for decades. And he's willing to do something about it, which means he gets my support. He gets my support. And so, yeah, we're going to continue to point out when things are going crazy. We're going to continue to point out when the media is obviously in the bag for one side or the other. But ultimately, I'm still going to do whatever it is within my mechanism, my power to do, in order to try to get the election result I want. Now, there's a certain piece I have about this. There's a certain piece I have about this election. Regardless of how it ends. Even if we lose, there's a certain piece I have, because I feel like if we lose under these conditions with a candidate that is so bad, with a media apparatus that has just completely bought in to propping up whatever the left wants, regardless of the circumstances or the evidence, that will at least tell us something. That will at least tell us something about where we're at. And I'm going to start to adjust what the potential solutions are. But we still got a chance right now, and I'm going to take that chance. So we're going to end it with this. Real quick, somebody tell me, what are your predictions? Right now, Kamala Harris is ahead in the polls. She's closed the gap in some of the swing states. What do you think is going to happen? I won't say election day. What do you think is going to happen over the next couple of months? Are we going to see a shift back in the other direction? Are we going to see Kamala actually do some interviews? Are we going to see, what are we going to see? So I'm going to start with Christian. What do you think?
Oh, boy. So I think we're going to have an election in November. And what's going to end up happening is somebody's going to win, and then things are going to continue to fly off the rails, because that's how things have been my entire lifetime. I have said before that nobody's coming to save you. We're not going to be able to vote our way out of this. I'm going to be voting for Trump. I mean, I bought the MAGA hat and everything. And if you know my history, that is kind of a big deal, because I used to be Trump's biggest hater. The reason that I want Trump to win is not because I think he's going to magically fix all of America's problems overnight. The reason I want Trump to win is because I think in some ways it's a soft form of accelerationism, in the sense that it will make the left lose their minds so much that it might end up kind of breaking them. Because right now the left is in some ways a well-oiled machine. Like, I mean, we've talked at length about this. They are the Leviathan. They have absolute control over institutions both in and outside of government. But if you get them off their game, they can make mistakes. These people are not infallible. In fact, they're very much fallible. They are not perfect creatures at all. They're not perfectly competent, and they're certainly not perfectly virtuous, despite the fact that they believe that they are. And I think that getting somebody like Trump in enables us to kind of catch them off guard and get them off their game. The way that I like to describe it is that we are facing a crisis where the only type of solution inside of government, and I think many of our solutions actually are found outside of government, but I think the only type of solution that is found inside of government is the type of solution that Javier Milei is currently applying, which is you take a chainsaw to the administrative state, you dismantle it, and that's currently what he's doing in Argentina. So. Yeah. I think that if Trump wins, sure, we might be in a better position to actually execute the Milei option, but that is a necessary but not sufficient set of circumstances for us to kind of get back to the type of country that we want to be at. If he loses, a lot of people ask me this, like, Christian, what are you going to do if Kamala Harris wins? And my response is going to be, I'm going to wake up the morning after the election, and I'm going to go about my life looking for the next opportunity to win. And the reason why is because ideas are eternal. They come back even when they fall out of favor. And no election outcome is going to change the fact that the left-wing, progressive, liberal worldview is utterly unworkable. Utterly unworkable. It doesn't matter how many elections they win. If they win this next election, all that they're simply doing is they are delaying the inevitable outcome of that worldview imploding in on itself. And it might make it more painful. Not even might. It guaranteed will make it more painful. But that does not change the ultimate outcome. All that it does is it inflicts more pain, and it might delay the outcome, or it might accelerate the outcome. Depends on what type of policy approach Harris ends up imposing if she wins. But I'm believe it or not, I'm actually not blackpilling over this. And the reason why is because, again, it's ideas. I want people to realize this. Parties come and go. In the United States, we have a two-party system, and the Republicans and Democrats have been around forever. But by and large, political movements come and go, but ideas are eternal. And the liberal worldview, the left-wing progressive worldview, is unworkable. It is currently imploding in on itself. That is why we call it clown world. It is currently imploding in on itself. A Harris win is simply just going to magnify the pain that is already taking place. And so from that perspective, it doesn't really matter what the outcome is. There's one outcome that is more preferred to the other because it might mitigate that pain, which is Trump getting elected. But it doesn't change the fact that The ideas that we believe in are true, and they will always come back even if they fall out of favor, and they look like they might be. I mean, I think that they are currently falling out of favor. And it also doesn't change the fact that the left-wing worldview is unworkable and is inevitably going to implode in on itself. Once you realize those two things are true, the election stuff is secondary to all of that.
All righty. So Christian predicts that things will happen. All right.
All right. I agree with Christian in one aspect, and that is if Kamala won, life would go on and we would have to find other ways to fight. I do think she's going to use the DOJ to go after her political opponents still. However, let me just be the person who is not black-pilled in the room and say I actually think Trump is still going to win. I say that based not on any data. I just it's the weird. I have a good feeling about this kind of situation, and I know that sounds stupid, but I think that Kamala has maxed out her support in the polls. I think that neither of these two candidates are above 50% in most polls, and it's really. I don't think the people that are supporting Kamala are going to leave her, and I don't think the people that are supporting Trump are going to leave him. So this really just comes down to who's going to make a better case from here until November for the people who have no idea where they're going to land because they have no morals and they're cowards. And so it's all up to the folks that just check how the wind is blowing that day and go out to vote. And that's a sad place to be, but I think that's where we are. And but I do think ultimately as soon as Kamala starts opening her mouth and speaking again, all this fanfare is going to start fizzling because she's a moron. She may do okay in the debates. We'll see. I mean, she supposedly was a prosecutor who could handle a courtroom pretty well. So maybe she, but I really just don't see her getting a boost after debates. We'll see. People are morons, so we'll just see. So yeah, that's my prediction is I still think Trump's going to win.
All right. So I'll go ahead and go into mine here. I think here's what's going to happen over the next couple of weeks. I think Kamala is getting a bump for all the reasons that we already mentioned. I think the convention also gave her a bit of a bump as well. Just not being Joe Biden and not being Donald Trump is reason enough for a significant part of the Democratic base that was a little bit skeptical of both Joe Biden from a voting perspective, but also from a donor perspective. And so I do think you're going to have more people that, again, the ones that they believe that Donald Trump is an existential threat to, life itself, they're going to start pouring more money into this at some point now that it's official. She's the person. There's no question. It is what it is. And the Democrats are essentially going to burn the ships at this point. Whatever the infighting was now, they're usually pretty good about getting in line and going from there. The real question has to do with specifically independent or swing voters in places like Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Arizona, Nevada, and Georgia. Really, that's where this comes down to. Right. So the national polls can say what they want. I don't particularly care. I'm far more concerned about what the sentiment is within particular states. What Kamala Harris says about fracking is going to have an impact in Pennsylvania because that supplies 500,000 jobs in Pennsylvania. That's significant, right? That's a significant portion of their economy. And so what it really comes down to is what is going to happen over the next couple of months in those areas. Is Kamala Harris going to be able to walk that thin line because she has a base which is so extreme and a base which they are increasingly scared of. They're increasingly scared of a base that will turn on them because they also see this as a long game issue. You have certain elements within the Democratic base that are either so unhinged that they're not going to vote strategically anymore, or they honestly believe that Trump for 4 more years might actually give them better results within state legislatures. It might actually give them better results long term. And so some are going to be thinking that way as well, which means that Kamala Harris has to walk this thin line between appeasing the base and not saying things that get her destroyed in Arizona, Pennsylvania, Georgia, and Wisconsin. That's tough, especially for someone like Kamala Harris, who is famous for just screwing up on the stump, getting trounced in debates. The amount of debate prep that she is going to have to go through in order to get out of that in a way that, especially with Trump's not going to engage in polite debate. He knows what issues he needs to hammer her on. And regardless of what the moderator asks, he's going to get those in such a way to where she's going to be forced into a very, very difficult spot. So I think the debate is going to end up hurting Kamala Harris. It's Trump's to lose in the debate. I think J.D. Vance will tear Tim Walz to pieces. I think Walz was something they picked as like, hey, you're a middle-aged fat white guy, right? Like you should appeal to all these people that we hate, right? But in reality, Walz fiddled while Minneapolis burned. Walz lied about being a combat veteran. Like, oh yeah, you shouldn't be allowed to carry these weapons, not like the ones I carried in war. Oh wow, war. Where did you serve, Tim? Italy in 1943. Because if it was a global war on terror, I didn't know that Italy was an option for going to combat. I definitely would have picked that over Iraq, right? So I think he's a joke. And I think J.D. Vance is going to do very well in that debate. Walz will actually probably do better in the debate than Kamala Harris will, because Walz will just go straight folksy and won't try to get into a big thing. He'll just engage in ad hominem attack. Kamala Harris gets visibly worked up on the stage. Like she can't help it. She has her nervous tics. She has her little laugh, and they're just going to meme the living hell out of it. So I think it's going to hurt her overall. Ultimately, I think Trump pulls it out, and I think Trump pulls it out primarily because of places like Pennsylvania and Arizona. I think because the border is such a big issue, I think that is going to hurt Kamala Harris on Arizona, and I don't see her recovering from that in a place like a swing state or a border state. And I think Pennsylvania, at the end of the day, is not going to tolerate this extreme element within. If she wanted Pennsylvania, she would have picked Shapiro as a running mate. But Shapiro was too Jewish for the Democratic Party right now. And that is going to have consequences within Pennsylvania. And so the end result is I think Trump pulls this out. I don't think it's going to be a blowout. I think it's going to be very close because the nation is divided along these lines. What I want people to understand, and this goes back to what Christian said, is that Trump winning this does not fix everything. And I will tell you this much. If Trump gets in there and he focuses exclusively off of, and I do think he should focus on improving the quality of life of Americans, right? I absolutely believe that. There's tax policy, there's regulatory policy, there's all sorts of things that he needs to tackle, and don't get us involved in any more big wars. That'd be a blessing, right? And all those would be beneficial. And he needs to do all of them. But I can't emphasize this enough. If you're not actually going after the federal bureaucracy, then the apparatus, which has caused so much of these problems and have allowed Democratic administrations to do whatever they want, while at the same time that they've hamstrung Republican ones, if you don't address that, then all we did was kick the can down the road for another 4 years. And what comes after that will probably be significantly worse. So I think he wins. I think he wins barely, but I think he wins. But the real question is going to be, what does he do with it? What does he do with it? All right. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for joining. Thank you for your comments. Also, consider going over to Circle, checking out our community. A lot of the information, or a lot of the shows that we pick, the topics that we pick, are influenced by our Circle community. Plus, we got some announcements coming out later this year that's going to be very exciting for our Circle community. So please go over there and join that. Also, again, this is your chance, man. Labor Day is coming up. We're going to have a long weekend. You're going to be grilling. All right, go over to Good Ranchers, use promo code Nick, get $25 off, get that subscription, get the free add-ons for an entire year. Do all of that. I promise you will not be disappointed. We eat a lot of Good Ranchers.
Women like
we're never
meat too,
disappointed.
Nick. He's like, listen to me, man. Okay, women too. We like meat. I love meat. I'm carnivore.
That was intentional.
Oh, boy. All right, and on that note.
Close this out, Nick.
Yeah. Before Tina goes full Tina. All right. Once again, thank you very much for joining us. Have a great weekend coming up. Go get yourself some Good Ranchers, and we will see you next episode.